Patrick O'Shaughnessy has one of the best business podcasts out there. The podcast is called Business Breakdowns, where he invites guests on to help him learn more about individual businesses. He's done Chipotle in the past, and recently he released one on Alibaba. And this was even before we knew that Monish Pabrai had purchased into Alibaba. His guest, Ram Parameswaran, is the founder of Octahedron Capital. Ram has been an investor in a handful of Chinese companies, including ByteDance, Pinduoduo, and Alibaba. So let's talk a little bit about what we can take away from Ram's insights into Alibaba from this podcast. I'll leave a link to the podcast in the video description below. You should definitely listen to it in its entirety. And please let me know in the comments if you've listened to this podcast and what your main takeaways were. All right, let's dig into what we can take away here. I want to talk about the idea that Alibaba is a country scale. Basically, what Ram means by this is that Alibaba could be a country in and of itself. He predicts that the GDP for Alibaba alone could be about $2.4 trillion in 5 years, and it currently stands at about $1.2 trillion now. So when you're producing that much volume, effectively you are your own country. So let's consider the population of China, which as of 2019 was about 1.4 billion people. Alibaba has about 800 million active users, and Ant Financial has that many, if not more. So we're seeing at least 60 or 70% of the total population in China using some sort of Alibaba service or product. So that customer base is pushing into the billions, not just millions. The final part is that Alibaba's product and service penetration is so deeply entrenched already into the everyday lives of Chinese consumers. Basically, he puts it this way, that if Amazon disappeared tomorrow in America, there would be some disruption, but eventually possibly Walmart or Target would help to fulfill that role of at least the e-commerce portion. But with Alibaba, he doesn't think that there would be a recovery from that in China. I wanted to start off with that notion because it's really important just to consider the sheer scale of Alibaba's impact on China. Ram says that, especially in America, there are a few misconceptions about the Alibaba business. We tend to want to think of a quick mental shortcut for comparing Alibaba to another company, and I think the most common one, and I have made this assumption in the past, is that Alibaba is basically the Amazon of China. Ram says that perhaps a more apt comparison, especially in the early days based on the original business model of Alibaba, would be a comparison to Google, because yes, Alibaba does have a booming e-commerce business, but advertising makes up a big portion of their monetization. From my perspective, when we talk about scale of business, the first company that comes to mind for me is Amazon. But compared to Alibaba, Ram says that Amazon is subscale. In 2015, Alibaba sold over $500 billion worth of volume in its two main e-commerce platforms, Tmall and Taobao. And as of 2020, that number more than doubled to $1.2 trillion worth. And Ram estimates that in another 5 years, it's going to double again to about $2.5 trillion worth of volume. So in terms of the total percentage of retail spending in China, in 2015, that was about 10%. In 2020, they made up 20% of all of the retail spending in China. And again, he estimates that by 2025, that'll be 25% of all retail spending in China. We can effectively think of Alibaba as a utility at scale. So users will go and purchase something on Alibaba first, and then seek out alternatives if they need to. He compared this to the streaming service Netflix, where first you purchase your subscription to Netflix, and then you look for additional alternatives after you've done that. You cut the cord, you're never gonna buy a cable subscription again. Where do you go? You go to Netflix first. So it's the primary way for Chinese consumers to interact with any sort of online financial, cloud computing, or e-commerce service, first and foremost. And by the way, that's not to say that there are not other good alternatives, but Alibaba is the first stop. This goes back to the idea of Alibaba being a country scale company, where they basically service the majority of the country. I'll give you one more amazing statistic. So we mentioned that Alibaba has about 800 million active users as of 2020. Each of those customers, on average, bought something from Alibaba twice a week. And that's discretionary spending. So I'm not talking about any necessities such as groceries or anything like that. A typical first-time user will spend about $400 on the platform per year. And after about 5 years, that number goes up to $2,000 per year. So as Alibaba's offering expands, just like Amazon, when they first started, they were only selling books. Alibaba was primarily only selling lifestyle and apparel, but now they've continued to expand their categories more and more. Li Lu mentioned in a recent talk that the Chinese economy is moving more towards a service and consumption model, and Ram echoes those sentiments here. So as the Chinese middle class continues to expand and grow, there will be more and more consumption happening, and a lot of that business, he thinks, is going to go to Alibaba. So from that idea, he thinks that the volume for Alibaba will double in 5 years to that $2.5 trillion number that I mentioned earlier. All right, let's move on to the scale of some of the businesses within Alibaba. And as I mentioned before, Alibaba seems to have penetrated into the daily lives of many of the Chinese consumers. For instance, the co-host Claire says that she gets her food delivered in the morning from Alibaba, and the news she consumes comes from an Alibaba news source. And in order to get around the city, she pays with Alibaba Pay on taxis and the DDs. So we already talked about how Alibaba is far and away the biggest e-commerce platform in the world, and they simply trounce Amazon in size. But another big part of Alibaba's business is their growing cloud computing business. AliCloud is the #1 cloud platform in China. More and more Chinese companies are transforming from an on-premises server structure to an on-cloud server structure. And all the while, as that happens, AliCloud earns 40 to 50 cents for every incremental dollar spent on AliCloud services. According to Ram, we might see 100 SaaS companies popping up in China, and who are they going to turn to for their cloud computing services? Well, most likely it's going to be AliCloud. And just think about that. If they're earning 40 to 50 cents on every dollar spent, that's a damn good business. And this business is still rapidly growing. It's probably growing north of 50% at this point still. Ram actually says that he compares what Alibaba Cloud looks like today to the early days of Amazon's AWS web service. There are some notable concerns about this business in China, especially because it's unclear whether or not companies will adopt these cloud services and pay for it as these American companies are willing to do with AWS and Azure and things like that. Overall, he thinks that the cloud business is misunderstood and not really priced into Alibaba at this point. Next, we have the third pillar of the businesses of Alibaba, which is their 33% stake in Ant Financial. AliPay seems to be one of those embryonic spawners that came out of Alibaba's incubation. The amazing thing about Ant Financial is that over time, he believes that it'll be even bigger than Alibaba itself. The reason being is that Ant Financial is one of the two main ways to interact financially online in China. He says it's the biggest money market product in the world. That makes it bigger than JP Morgan. They have wealth management products, insurance products, lending products. They offer everything, and it's basically a one-stop shop for your digital financial needs. And again, as I mentioned before, the AliPay platform has over 800 million active users. So Ram believes that the true power of Alibaba comes from their e-commerce business, their cloud business, and the AliPay business. And that's not meant to belittle all the other businesses that they have, such as the grocery business or the news business, because eventually those might be valued as fairly large businesses, but they pale in comparison to the impact of the cloud business, the e-commerce business, and the financial business. So it looks like we have 3 core pillars to rely on for Alibaba's growth going into the future. We can talk a little bit about the history of Alibaba from here. It was interesting to find out that originally Alibaba was basically a clone of eBay. Essentially, Jack Ma took a pretty simple approach to grab an effective and thriving business in America and just port it to China. A lot of their earlier businesses were simply just copy and pastes. So in the early days, Alibaba would fall into the category of a clone or spawner. There's a great quote in the interview. The ethos in Alibaba is all about platform creation. Take friction to zero, create collective good for everybody, and let everybody benefit in the process and be the meta aggregator on top of it. So from the get-go, Alibaba's main goal was to reduce friction to enter their ecosystem. There's a lot more to learn about the history of Alibaba, but I think that's a pretty good idea of what the ethos for the company is. Ram talked a little bit about the logistics business for Alibaba as well. Some competitors, such as JD, have built pretty much their own in-house logistics system. But Alibaba kind of hacked this. Instead of expanding their own warehouses and distribution systems throughout all of China to all of the tier 2 and tier 3 cities, they basically piggybacked on other existing companies. Of course, it's really capital intensive to build all of your own proprietary distribution systems. There's so many things to consider. There's warehouses, there's supply chains, there's delivery, there's last mile delivery, all sorts of different things. So what Alibaba did was basically create a software layer on top of all of these third-party existing logistics companies. So they were connecting all of these local suppliers via their Cainiao network. These merchants would then turned to Alibaba to sell their wares as well. So once Alibaba made it very easy for all these entrepreneurs to sell online on their platforms, they went to Alibaba. Alibaba had this network in place, so it made it a lot easier for them. So part of the genius of Alibaba was basically to take these equity stakes in all of these distributed logistics and suppliers, and in that way, they basically have a hand, or what we could call soft control, over these companies. They were able to achieve high scale in a very capital-intensive business through what we could call hacks. They took the asset-light approach, which we all know is great for margins, and instead of building out their own warehouses, they built software and took equity stakes in suppliers in order to expand their business. Ram ties this back to the ethos of Alibaba, where he says that what's special about Alibaba, nothing was given to them, they could take nothing for granted. And this sort of relates to how Ram views the competitive aspects of China in general. He basically says that Chinese companies would run circles around American companies, including Amazon. There's such fierce competition in China, and with fierce competition comes aggressive growth and innovation. And so there's always new waves of competitors coming into a space, so the reigning champions will never be able to rest on their laurels. So that might be one thing that's maybe misunderstood when we have fears about the competition overtaking Alibaba. On one hand, we see a bunch of competition coming in from other competitors, but on the other hand, Alibaba has lived this way. This is in their essence as a company. Alibaba knows that they can't take anything for granted, and they're gonna fight like hell to keep the competitors at bay. And any discussion of Alibaba wouldn't be complete without talking about the competition. So we just talked about how fierce the competition in China really is. According to Ram, there are three main e-commerce players in China. First, we have JD, which he actually considers to be the closest replica to Amazon that we have in China. Their tech and their logistics and their infrastructure is not as good as Amazon, but they're most similar to Amazon. He says that Alibaba is far and away more technologically superior to JD. Another new competitor is Pinduoduo. Li Lu actually has a small investment in Pinduoduo. But unlike JD, Pinduoduo is more of an advertising model, not a pure e-commerce play. You'll probably want to listen to the whole interview to get Ram's take on Pinduoduo, but needless to say, he is an investor in Pinduoduo, and he couldn't be more excited about the future of that company. Now, Pinduoduo has a ton of active users, and I think recently they matched or exceeded Alibaba's active users. Pinduoduo is a gamified platform where they sell very low-cost products. Their main priorities are maximizing user mindshare and user time on the platform. So they're kind of building a mini Alibaba in a way. And we could say that Pinduoduo is standing on the shoulders of giants, where Alibaba basically built this infrastructure in China, or the roadmap to build a company like this, and Pinduoduo is taking advantage. We might also put Meituan in the mix. And these companies are eating into Alibaba's market share. In 2015, Alibaba had about 80% market share for the e-commerce business. This type of dominance, of course, won't last. Ram mentions that in America, at Walmart's peak, they only had about 15% of the total market share. With that type of dominance, there are just going to be a ton of companies trying to eat into that share. He also brings up the comparison that Amazon is losing a little bit of market share to Wayfair, but is that making Amazon's business any less relevant? One of the big concerns for Alibaba and its shareholders is that companies like Pinduoduo completely eat away at their market share. If users are spending more time on Pinduoduo, then naturally that means that they're probably not spending as much time on Alibaba. But again, Alibaba is still deeply entrenched throughout China. It's easier said than done, but Alibaba is just going to have to continue to innovate and reinvent itself, spin off new businesses in order to stay relevant in China. They've been doing it throughout their whole history, and my prediction is that they'll continue to do it in the future. I hope that shed a little bit more light on Alibaba's business. There's so much more to learn about Alibaba than that was covered in this interview, but I believe this is a great primer to get started learning about Alibaba. Again, let me know in the comments below if there's anything that you found really interesting from this interview. Please do listen to the full podcast episode. It's excellent, and you learn so much about Alibaba. Back when Charlie Munger bought into Alibaba, I did a little bit of a dive into Alibaba over here if you want to check that out. Otherwise, please like the video and subscribe to the channel if you want to stay up to date with all my future investing videos. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you watching this all the way to the end, and I will see you in the next video.